Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to continue right along with our discussion on Dick Nixon and his administration. And before we begin our lecture topic for today proper, I'd just like to do our customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture we looked at the the rise and the fall of Richard Nixon politically. Beginning in 1946, he enters Congress, had the freshman representative from the freshman congressman from California. He very quickly rises in the anti-communist hysteria of the early stages of the Cold War to become a senator from California. He quickly wins election in 1950 as a senator, and then in 1952 he's picked up by Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, in his presidential bid in 1952, and he's retained in 1956. After serving 2 terms as the vice president of the United States, Nixon is given the standard, the party standard, and endorsed as the Republican candidate for the presidency. Now, Nixon himself runs a very brilliant campaign. He campaigns against John F. Kennedy. Nixon and Kennedy had these wonderful debates, both televised and distributed over the radio. And it's really a toss-up over who wins. Those who saw it say Kennedy won. Those who listened to it said Nixon won. But in any event, Nixon loses. He loses that president. He loses the presidential campaign, and then he also loses a campaign for the governorship of California. Now, both campaigns happen within a 2-year span. The presidential election is in 1960. The gubernatorial election is in 1962. Nixon loses to both of them, and Nixon then appears to be finished politically. He's broken politically, exhausted politically, and emotionally he's also very fraught, very fragile. He breaks his customary cool with the reporters, and he uncharacteristically and emotionally lashes out, telling them that they won't have old Dick Nixon around to kick around anymore. But then he embarks on this remarkable political rebuilding campaign, beginning in 1964 with the defeat of Barry Goldwater. Goldwater loses, and he loses badly to Lyndon Johnson in the 1964 presidential election. Between 65 and 68, Nixon rebrands and attracts older and even some younger Republicans to his banners, saying that he's the man with whom they should put their vested interest in, and he's the man who can lead them to better days. What he does in staking out this political revival is nothing short of miraculous. Few politicians in any system could survive 2 public disgraces in such a short amount of time the way he did. To lose at the national and then at the state level and come back, just unheard of. Once in office, Nixon embarks on truly stupefying foreign policy campaigns. One, Vietnamization, the process by which he's going to remove United States forces from Vietnam and hopefully put the South Vietnamese government in a position to defend itself. They taunt with the Soviet Union, and of course they taunt with China. Both just truly wonderful, truly successful, great public relation coups for any president in the Cold War to have. And from there we turn to his domestic policies. And this is where Nixon really just fell flat on his face, where he just proved to be utterly incapable of counteracting what was happening. And we begin with the Watergate break-in of 1972. And that really changed the entire course of history for the Nixon administration and the course of affairs for the United States. It was an unnecessary and ruinous tragedy for Dick Nixon in many ways. It was a tragedy It was a tragedy that played out in film for Nixon's career. It was like a tragic film or a tragic play. The end of his career, much like the tragedy of Macbeth, or any other sort of tragic play or tragic instance. You can think of the career or the end of the career of Alcibiades of Athens. You can think of the career of Mark Antony. That's a nice one to compare it to. You can even compare it to, let's say, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was certainly a genius, but he was a very flawed and very tragic genius. The very thing that he wanted to preserve, in the end, his policies helped to ensure its destruction. His policies were designed to keep France isolated and to keep Germany strong, to keep Prussia at the head of Germany, to just see that go on continuously. But the policies that he put in place, the policies that he pursued, ultimately led to the destruction of the state that he wanted to preserve and wanted to protect and defend. Now, moving on from that, going back to Nixon, Watergate was a fatal flaw. In 1972, Nixon was on top of the world, having accomplished major feats in the realm of foreign policy. He had established détente internationally, and he was pursuing an acceptable domestic policy. Nixon's presidency also had the added prestige of the Apollo moon landing, and yet events were set in motion that would disgrace him, his presidency, and his legacy. The story of Watergate begins with a group of burglars known as the Plumbers. I spoke of this group before, but I'll go into greater detail about them. They were comprised of James McCord, Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Baker, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. These men bugged the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate complex. They were caught by a security guard, Frank Willis, who notified Washington area police and helped detain the group until the police showed up. Now, after their arrest, they denied any kind of link to the White House or to the president. Now, McCord was a member of an organization called CREEP, CRP, pronounced CREEP. And CREEP stood for Committee to Re-elect the President, who was Nixon. The president was in reference to Nixon. Now, to Washington Post journalists, journalists heard about the break-in. Robert Woodruff and Carl Bernstein. The pair pursued the story tenaciously at first. And at first, their editors looked at it and said, "This is a nothing story. Go find something. Go find something else." Many thought that the break-in was unconnected to the president. One. Many thought that that the real issue was the president's groundswell victory in the 1972 election. Now, Woodruff and Bernstein were convinced there was a link between Nixon, the break-in, and the election. They cultivated sources who aided them to establish links to the Nixon administration. One of the most important of these sources was a man named Mark Felt, who was given the code name Deep Throat after a popular pornographic film of the era. The identity of Deep Throat remained a mystery until the early 21st century, when Felt was outed as the informant. Now, the pair wrote a book about their escapades called All the King's Men, which was later adapted into a film. Pretty good film. Now, Nixon won the election in 1972. He won it easily over the Democratic candidate, George McGovern. And George McGovern was among the weakest political candidates fielded by any of the major parties in the 20th century. He represented the Democratic Party left, which had a very intense following, but was a minority faction within the Democratic Party, reminiscent of how the numerically inferior radical Republicans held sway over the party a century before. The big game of the election, the big game with elections really is finding a way to gain slightly more than 50% of a vote. Because as any political science student will tell you, as any political science teacher or any politician will tell you, any political organizer will tell you, 50% of the vote yields you 100% of the power. Now, it was highly improbable that McGovern was ever going to receive the votes necessary to defeat Nixon. It was a foregone conclusion that McGovern was going to lose. Now, at the campaign, that was from the beginning. He was a severe underdog. Now, from the very beginning of the McGovern campaign, things went wrong. They got progressively worse as time went on for McGovern. His first running mate, a man named Thomas Eagleton, had received electroshock therapy when he was younger to help him treat depression. Now, this overshadowed any of his positive traits, any of the professional accomplishments of Eagleton, and cast a doubt on McGovern's his ability to surround himself with competent advisors. His judgment was called into question because of the choice of Eagleton as vice president. Many people were ill at ease with the prospect of having a vice presidential candidate who had had depression and had received electroshock therapy to treat that depression. He was seen as an invalid selection as the vice presidential nominee. And at first, McGovern stood by Eagleton, defending his state of mind and his ability to serve in office. But as the pressure mounted, McGovern caved in and he dropped Eagleton, picking up Sergeant Shriver, a member of the Kennedy family. Now, this decision, far from making McGovern look like he was getting on track, made him look weak. It made him look weak. It made him look indecisive, and it caused him to lose support. And that reflected in the polls. The election results were as lopsided as in 1972 as they had been in 1964. Now, there was another viable candidate for president on the Democratic side, Senator Edward Kennedy, the younger brother of John and Robert Kennedy. Now, Edward Kennedy was the top choice for president. He could have made a very strong showing. He could have made a very strong push in 1968 and later. But later in 1969, his presidential political reputation, and his chances of being president were permanently ruined with the Chappaquiddick affair. He never really had a strong chance or a definite chance of being president after the Chappaquiddick affair. He was never a serious contender for party nomination. Now, the Chappaquiddick affair involved the death of a young woman with whom it is believed Kennedy was having a romantic affair with. She drowned in a car that he was driving. He fled the scene. He fled the scene after the car fell over into the river. He fled the scene. He left the car and she drowned. She died. And it was intense media scrutiny over that. George Wallace returned to the Democratic Party, and he campaigned for the office until he was shot and he was paralyzed. The remaining candidates were all subpar fellows, and McGovern was selected to lead the party, to lead a party that was severely hamstrung. Now, Nixon, after his second inauguration, was in a very awkward position, as we all can imagine. On the one hand, he had to appear to be prosecuting Watergate as vigorously as possible while simultaneously covering the whole affair up. He had to put on the public face of, I'm law and order, I'm going to do the right thing, while simultaneously giving cues to his subordinates and making promises to his subordinates to very quickly and very expeditiously cover up the whole affair. In 1973, he appeared on national television and tried to replicate the public relation coup he accomplished with the Checker scandal, with the Checker speech. He appointed Archibald Cox, who was then a Harvard University law professor, as the special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate to investigate the Watergate break-in. The Senate Watergate Committee conducted a series of hearings through the summer of 1973, and bit by bit, the committee began to find evidence that Nixon and his aides had committed burglary, bribery, invasion of privacy, blackmail, destruction of evidence, perjury, and had taken faithful steps, the faithful steps of making preparations to issue executive pardons for those who kept quiet and kept the president's name out of the investigation. Now, slowly, a tapestry of criminality began to take shape. Eventually, three great questions were raised, and they really remain with us. How much did the president know? Did he try to stop what was going on? And did he orchestrate these events? Now, the most damaging and astonishing evidence was the discovery of the secret Oval Office recordings made by President Nixon. Nixon refused to hand over the tapes to the Senate committee, citing executive privilege, which shields the president from having to make full disclosure during his term in office. Now, for reasons of national security or diplomatic confidentiality, a president can cite executive privilege to sort of cloak their movements and cloak their aspirations. Eventually, he was forced to turn over the tapes, and their content incriminated him. He had an executive secretary long before his presidency, long before his tenure as vice president, back when he was still a congressman. He had this executive secretary named Rosemary Woods, and she worked with him for more than 20 years. And she was utterly loyal to him, and she had the job of transcribing the tapes that were being handed over to the investigators. And on one of the tapes that was supposed to be handed over, investigators found that she had erased 18 minutes of extremely incriminating information. When questioned as to how she did that, she claimed it was an accident from operating the dictaphone, an excuse that was later disproved by recreating her bodily movements. Now, the passage that was deleted was not the most damaging for Nixon. The tapes contained very coarse and degrading language, attacked language that degraded and attacked his enemies. The language horrified the Republic as much as Nixon's conduct during this whole affair, during this whole scandal. The tapes contained racial slurs, threats, and of course use of bodily harm, the heavy use of profanity. In an interesting twist, the public reading of the tapes gave rise to the popular term expletive. If you've ever used closed caption or listened to debates on free speech or morality or public morality, you know that expletive is something that is used quite a bit. If you ever watch a movie on network television, expletive will be featured whenever there's the use of profanity. During the public readings of these of the Nixon tapes, every time coarse language was used, the text would read expletive deleted. Now, through the remainder of the 20th century and into the early 21st century, expletive was used to censor profanity. It still is. It's a sort of holdover, sort of legacy from the Nixon administration. One question about the tapes has mystified researchers, historians, and all other interested parties. And that question is, why didn't Nixon delete the tapes? No one can answer that question. It for sure is perplexing. We all wish we can get an answer for it, but the only person who could ever answer why Dick Nixon did not delete those tapes is Dick Nixon, and Dick Nixon died some 25 years ago. And even after he left the office, he never once, he wrote books and autobiographies afterwards, and he never once explained why he kept those tapes. No one can ever tell you why he kept those tapes. But it is an interesting question. It is something that a lot of people speculate about. And one of the speculations is that Nixon was just he was just under this illusion that he would never fall. He would never fail. He was under the illusion that when the tapes came out, people would judge him not on the merit of those tapes, but on the merit of his entire political career, and they would say that it was a necessary evil, or they would give him some other form of slack. Others say that others hold that Nixon had this very conceited view of himself. He had this very sort of self-centered attitude, and he felt that he was such a major political figure that whatever happened, he again would be vindicated by later generations who would hold his legacy and his tapes in high regard. They would eschew what was said on those tapes and say that this was all for the necessary good. This was a necessary evil. He had that sort of argument going, some people think. Another is that the tapes were part of a planned memoir that he wanted to write, and that he thought that they would be of vital importance to future generations. Like I stated earlier, there's no real explanation for why he kept the recordings. But in an interesting twist, it is interesting and important to note that Lyndon Johnson has secret recording equipment set up in the Oval Office. The Watergate affair sort of sheds light into this. It was found out during the Watergate affair, during the investigation, that Johnson had tapes, and Johnson tapes have been listened to. They're not in a secret vault, and they were used to construe pro-administration arguments and essays and points for people supporting Lyndon Johnson's administration. And maybe the reason that Nixon did so was to create a body of work in which people can come back and evaluate his presidency and laud him for his efforts at governing, his tenure as president. The Watergate affair had to be taken in consideration with the larger tradition of public espionage in American politics. It certainly is damning to know that the president is having people break into his opponents, but other political figures, other major political figures, other presidents have done the exact same thing. When we look back at Eugene Debs at the running against what's his name? Debs being the Socialist Party standard bearer, running against Woodrow Wilson. Eugene Debs had to do that from prison. Debs was jailed, and he had to field his press conferences. He had to invite reporters and get reporters to sign up to come and interview and to listen to him from jail. And there are very striking images of Debs behind jail bars giving interviews with reporters. And the sad thing about it is that Woodrow Wilson did not release Debs after the election. Debs hadn't really broken any laws. He was prosecuted under fluffed up charges, and he remained in prison until long after Wilson's death. Warren Harding would eventually release Eugene Debs from prison in the 1920s. But moving on from Debs and Wilson, we go into figures like we go into figures like John Kennedy. We go into figures like Roosevelt, and Roosevelt spied on his opponents, and Kennedy had done the exact same thing. Washington politics had always been a rough and tumble affair, dating all the way back to the beginning of politics within Washington town, had the city recall back then. One looks at the Jefferson administration, when James Callender, a former ally of Jefferson, outed Jefferson for his long-standing affair with the Jefferson family slave Sally Hemings, in retaliation for not being granted the office of Postmaster General. Callender was shortly murdered. He was found drowned in about 3 feet of water. Nobody was ever arrested for the crime, but it's always been a very rough environment, Washington politics. We look at the House of Representatives in 1974. They began to make preparations for indicting Richard Nixon for his role in Watergate. They were preparing to indict him for high crimes and misdemeanors, setting the stage for his impeachment. Congress also denied Nixon's appeal for renewed military efforts in Vietnam. The situation in Vietnam was bleak. The arrangement between the United States and the two rival Vietnamese states broke down as North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. Congress refused to act. They refused to reopen military engagements in Vietnam out of fear of arousing the deep-seated angst and animosity the public had for the Vietnam War. Now, the Watergate scandal was very disruptive to the normal political affairs of the Republic. Foreign policy became lethargic. For almost 2 years as the scandal unfolded. Nixon was visited by Hugh Scott, John Jacob Rhodes, and Barry Goldwater. Scott and Rhodes were the Republican leaders in the Congress, in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, and Goldwater was a party old guard grandee. The three of them laid the facts out bare to Nixon, that the House of Representatives was going to vote to impeach him, that the Senate would convict him. Faced with the reality of impeachment, Nixon finally gave in and he resigned, denying to the end that he had done anything wrong. Now Nixon, after resigning the presidency, lived through to the early 90s, to 1993, writing several foreign policy books, which buoyed his reputation as a talented tactician, strategist, and of course politician. And he also reinforced the idea or the fact really that he was a foreign policy expert. After Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford, the former Republican leader in the House of Representatives, succeeded him as president. Now, Ford acceded because Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, also resigned during the course of the Watergate investigation, but not really to anything Watergate related. It was discovered that he had been the recipient of a number of political bribes when he served as the governor of Maryland. Ford was selected as Nixon's new vice president because he was a long-term party member in the House of Representatives and a highly respected Michigan politician. Now, the combination of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal created a mood of heightened suspicions and popular skepticism within the Republic that led to widespread disillusionment. We'll break here. Well, we won't break it at the end of our discussion on Richard Nixon, but we shall break here, and we will come back, and we will begin our sort of like end phase, not our end phase, we'll begin our lectures on the Republic after Dick Nixon, the Carter and the Carter administrations bleeding into the Reagan administrations. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.